but it used to be that the big eat the small, but now it's the fast that eat the slow. That ability to adapt in real time is more valuable than ever and has been certainly highlighted by COVID.
Welcome, Allison. Thank you so much for taking time to have a chat with me about becoming an investor. So maybe we'll start with the beginning. How did you get started? What were you doing before being an investor?
Well, it's a long road to look back, I suppose. I started my career in finance, but not necessarily because I wanted to be an investor. I was more just interested in being financially independent, building a career where I could do that, being around smart people, and spending time internationally. So I ended up interning at Goldman Sachs and then working there full-time after graduation. And I was there in the middle of the financial crisis, which seems like a less important crisis now that we're living through this one. But at the time, it felt like a really big deal. And I was seeing how quickly both policy and technology were changing the business at Goldman in real time. And it was clear to me that if I wanted to build a long-term successful career, I needed to be in technology because that's what was taking all of the jobs around me, as well as reducing the salaries of the jobs that weren't being eliminated. So I ended up joining General Assembly, which was at the time a startup. It was only about 10 people in New York, and everybody told me I was crazy, but I was really passionate about the problem they were solving, which was helping professionals build careers in technology. So we were training professionals in the technical skills they needed to build a career in the digital age. So web development, digital marketing, user experience design, and that's how we met. And I first got introduced to venture capital at the time because that was the type of investment that General Assembly took. So we raised venture investment and used that to grow quickly. And that's how I moved to Asia because we raised a round of funding and wanted to be a global business. And so moved to Hong Kong and was working on building up our company there. And through that process, I ended up getting into venture and back into investing more from an entrepreneurial mindset, which is part of what I think makes me a little bit different in the context of people who are career investors. I saw a gap in the market, and there was a lot of investment flowing into education technology in the US, but there was nobody doing the same thing on the other side of the world. And so that's why I decided to get into venture, because I felt like there was a market need that I could fill. So that's how I got started in venture capital, although I guess my investor roots sort of began a lot earlier in a way.
I remember 2012, 2013 when we first met. And it was the first time I heard about General Assembly, and I loved the idea of it, being able to retrain professionals or upskill them with engineering tool set so that they could be able to fill the jobs that really need to be filled. Can you tell us a bit more about your time really like building a startup, working in the startup and building out their Asia presence? What was that experience like, and how did it inform your investor role down the road?
It was amazing. It was so exciting. For me, being in finance, pure finance, when I started my career, it felt like I was seeing the world in black and white. And it was very two-dimensional. There was one way to be successful, and that's how you had to do it. And either you did it or you didn't. And it was very cut and dry. But when I joined the startup world, it felt like the world was going to 3 dimensions. And all of a sudden it was in color, because everything was an opportunity. There were so many problems to be solved, and I just had to use my mind in ways that I never had to when there was such a clear-cut path forward. And I just really enjoyed that, the magnitude of the problems that we were solving and the creativity that you could use to be successful was really, really invigorating for me. And on top of that, at General Assembly, we had a really strong mission, and that was helping professionals pursue work that they loved. And that was something that felt so important to me. It motivated me every day and ultimately allowed me to connect with amazing people like you, who, if I had showed up on day one and said, here, buy this product, that's a completely different conversation versus showing up and saying, hey, here's this problem I'm trying to solve. Would you like to work with me on that? So I learned the power of being mission driven and how exciting that was, how energizing it was, and how much it impacted my ability to be successful in what was otherwise a really challenging task, right? To set up this business, a new type of business in a completely different place and culture. So I think I still carry that through to how I invest today, because there are a lot of investors that are really only motivated by money. And for me, that was never enough. So I like to solve big problems.
I love what you talked about in terms of dimension, right? That's the most exciting part of any job, when it can offer you multi-dimensions, whether it's purpose, whether it's the ability to create, to serve, to impact, and of course, at the end of the day, to be sustainable. But that's not the only metric of success. Going back to kind of General Assembly, how did you segue from General Assembly into your investing role?
One of the most amazing things about the experience at General Assembly was it was my job to build a strong network of talented people. And when I reflect on my career as an investor, but also just my career in general, I don't think I fully understood at the beginning of it how important people were going to be. And so building a network of talented people that share your values and share your mission is the most important asset that I built during that time. And it's ultimately what led me into venture. So I was meeting all of these amazing entrepreneurs, as well as meeting a lot of really interesting investors. And that's how I met Thesis, who was my co-founder at Fresco, and how we started working together. So it really wasn't, if you build a network of people that share those values and that mission, you'll often find the best opportunities come to you instead of you going after them. And so it was a case where it was never my plan to get into venture, but Thesis knew what I was doing and knew what I cared about and approached me about the opportunity to start investing together.
100%. I think, if my recollection of you, Allison, when you first came to Hong Kong was you parachuted into Hong Kong, and within like a month, maybe, like you had the network in place to build out the business. And like you said, I think, regardless of what we're working on, having the right people in place, and I love how you connected that with values, like people who believe in the same things to work together on. And on that note, what do you look for in a network, or what do you look for in the values of the people that you surround yourself with? I think that would be really helpful for folks who are thinking about building out this network in order to possibly become an investor and entrepreneur down the road.
It's interesting to me because having moved to different cities several times over the course of my career, I was in New York, I was in Boston for college, and then New York, and then Hong Kong, and then Tokyo, and then now in San Francisco. And networking has somehow become an activity that people talk about. And so I kind of believe building a network is something that you do it best when you don't mean to do it, in a way, because otherwise it becomes very, very transactional. So when I look for people that I want to bring into my network, they're people that are very mission driven. They have a problem that they want to solve, and they have a certain level of creativity and sense of service. So they actually do come to every conversation thinking, what can I learn from you? How can I help you? And then how does that advance us to our common goals? And so I think that's a really important thing that you can suss out pretty quickly in an early conversation of like, what does this person care about? How do they treat me? Are they interested in adding value to what I'm doing? And are they thinking creatively about how we might be able to collaborate? Because I have a lot of conversations with people that just want one thing. They want funding, or they just want a connection to some other investor. And those are not the kind of people that I want in my network, because I know that they probably are just approaching everybody that way, and they don't think about relationships as deeply and thoughtfully as I believe you need to think about them in order to be successful in the long run. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
I mean, that is so insightful. I remember, I used to walk into meetings with you and you'd have your moleskin and your pen and you'd write everything down. Oh my gosh, Allison's writing it all down. Okay, maybe I should write it all down too. And I love what you talked about in terms of the learning aspect, right? Like it's very, very off-putting to come into a meeting where it's very transactional and it's very one way, or it's zero sum. But it's always exciting to meet a person who comes in to talk about why they're passionate about something, or what they're really angry about and they want to like fix or solve for it. And you're right, these are the people that we'd hang out with even if we didn't work together or we didn't invest in each other, because at some point we'd find a way to collaborate because we're just interested in each other's sort of ideas and sense of service to their community and their network. So you talked a bit about cities, going in from Boston, New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and back to San Francisco now. So what was that journey like, moving around the world and finding new opportunities? How did you search for those opportunities, and what was the experience like?
It was incredible. I didn't grow up traveling, so for me, I really set the goal of wanting to live abroad and put myself in an environment where I was removing myself from everything that I knew. I saw it as a process of self-discovery, to see what I was capable of, to see what made me me versus just how I ended up kind of reacting to my environment growing up. So that was always a goal for me. But the most interesting thing during that process that I discovered was that no matter how hard you expect moving to a new place to be, it's actually way harder. And you get there and you don't know anybody. You are completely a fish out of water. You're starting from ground zero. It's very challenging, but I do think the process was incredibly empowering because it reminded me what I was capable of. And now I know that I'm capable of building something from nothing, which has always been my aspiration as an entrepreneurial spirit, is to build something from nothing. So it was an incredible experience. I absolutely wouldn't trade it for the world. I think it has brought me a level of perspective and creativity and empathy that you never get if you just stay in one place. So I really enjoyed that. I think there's a lot of really interesting points of intersection across those different ecosystems. There's patterns that you can see of the timing of when things kind of happen or take off. But at the same time, I think it gave me a new appreciation for localization, because each place really is different and people have a different culture and mindset. And so you have to, I think, learn that and then figure out how to work within it if you're going to be successful in a new place.
I have heard of other, women in investing talk about a similar idea of putting yourself in a position where you're outside of your comfort zone in order to learn about things that you don't know, and also, like you said, self-discovery. And I love what you said about empowering. Like when you start from zero and start with nothing and discover that you discover that, hey, there's a lot more I can do with very little resources. What led you back to San Francisco? Like it's almost like full circle now. Like what led you to San Francisco? Was it 2-3 years back?
Yeah, it's been a couple years now, which is pretty crazy to think about how fast time goes by. But I decided to move to San Francisco because I found myself several years into what was appearing to look like a career in venture capital. And a big motivating factor for me in venture has always been changing it, because I do think there's a lot about it that is very old school, that lacks diversity and creativity of thought, and that if we're going to unlock true innovation, we need to make it accessible to everybody. And that was always a really motivating factor for me. But at the same time, I started to realize that there was a lot about venture that I didn't understand from a systemic level. And I truly believe that if you want to change something, you have to understand it. And I knew the best way to do that was to move to San Francisco and go work on Sand Hill Road and really understand the ins and outs of how traditional venture capital funds work and why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, and figure out kind of how I wanted to change it from there. So that was a big part of it for me. And I also think there's a time in your life where you want to be closer to your family. And I had this amazing experience being in Asia, but my family was very far away, and that was difficult for me too. And while I like to think I'm a superhuman, you still need your people. And so it was time for me to come back.
Got it. I'm curious about changing venture capital. I 100% agree with you. There's a lot about it that is very old school. And there are times, we must question, the things that worked before, do they still work now? What are some of the pieces of the puzzle that you think could be open to evolving?
One piece I'm really interested in right now is what we discussed before, which is networks. And venture is a game where you're investing in companies and people with a very, very long list of unknowns and a very, very long time horizon that just exponentially increases the number of unknowns when it comes to what might the outcome be of that business, and therefore your return on your investments. So I think it's very natural for people to invest in others who are like them, or people that are already part of their network, or if you basically blindly invest a large amount of money in someone, it's helpful if they live in your neighborhood, or their kids play with your kids on their soccer team and you see them every weekend anyway. And there's this level of transparency that comes with that. And so I believe if we're going to make venture capital accessible to minorities, women, people that aren't the classic tech bro who, grows up on, at Stanford and Sand Hill Road, then we need to figure out how to expand those networks and how to help everyone kind of build powerful networks that can lead them to that type of capital in the long run. And ultimately, that's the type of network that will make companies successful as well, right? I mean, you need more than just money. You need people that can refer you to great people to hire, and people that can refer you to customers. And so I think networks are a bigger part of success than people usually recognize. And they're certainly a huge part of how venture works. And so I really want to try to crack that open a little bit if we're going to change it in the long run.
That is so exciting to hear. I think cracking this network challenge, we live in the two pockets of the world where there's a lot of capital and a lot of talent. Whether it's the Bay Area nearby San Francisco or the greater Bay Area nearby Hong Kong, Shenzhen. And you're right, there's actually a lot of homogeneity here because people are quite similar, so they'll come up with the same problems and have the same solutions. What other types of networks should we look further into? You talked a bit about women, you talked about minority. Tell us more about what you're thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been really fascinated by this emerging study of networks. Network science is actually an emerging category of research, understanding how these connections can support success in the long run. It's also, I think, a big factor for just mental health generally is having a strong network of supporters and relationships of what I call regenerative relationships. So people that make you better in challenging times. So I think building personal networks is just as important as building professional networks. But there's also an element to diversifying networks, which can be really important. So, for example, if you think about the crisis that's happening across the world right now, it's a risk that not many people really anticipated. And if you only surround yourself with people that have the same life experience or the same perspective or the same problems as you, they might not be able to say, then it might be very difficult to predict some of these challenges down the road. But for example, having spent time in Asia, wearing a face mask and all of the previous sort of SARS crisis, there was a level of respect for a pandemic that I think the US just had never experienced in this lifetime. And so anyone that had those connections or that experience saw the current crisis in a different light. So there's a lot of value to diversifying because you can see risks in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yes, and this connects back to kind of your point about being local and being global, and also investing in mainstream, but also diversifying that investment pool. At the end of the day, that's what capital does, right? It helps us fuel a future we want to live in. And now more than ever, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of a world do we want to live in? And how do we be a part of the building blocks to making that happen? I'm also curious about how you mentioned about unknowns. Investing is probably 80% about unknowns, especially in early stage. How do you manage unknowns, and how do you manage those moments when founders want to give up, or when you want to give up?
There's so many unknowns all the time. If we learned anything from 2020, it's that you can't even imagine the things that are going to happen or go wrong. And so it's not an easy thing to manage, for sure, whether you're a founder or you're an investor. And I think there's different types of unknowns. There's certainly circumstantial unknowns, like, a global pandemic or crazy wildfires in California right now. And those you can't control, but what you can control is how you react to them and what you do with them. And one option is to shut down and give up. And another option is to adapt and evolve and figure out how to turn some of those challenges or changing circumstances into an opportunity. And so I think the most important thing is surrounding yourself with people that have a similar mindset of innovation. And, I don't think changing course means giving up. And I've made a lot of pivots in my life and changes, and I see them as new opportunities as opposed to, a failure in any way, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And echoing your word previously, regenerative, right? Not only do we have to work with people who are regenerative, we have to be regenerative ourselves. And like you said, pivoting and being creative and being multidimensional, those are all the elements we look for in the founders we invest in. So, these are also things we have to emulate ourselves. And yeah, in the beginning of the year, we called all of our portfolio companies and we're like, guys, the world's changing. We are about 3 months ahead of you. We know what's going to hit. So get ready to adapt, adapt or die. This is how ruthless the industry is, but it also, I think, in a way, rewards those who are adaptive.
Totally.
We're talking about things that I feel like we didn't learn much at school. Could you maybe just tap slightly back into the past? Like, what did you study in college? And if you could go back in time now and sort of give some advice to your 18-year-old or 21-year-old self, what would you recommend?
I studied economics and film studies, which I don't know that I've used any of that content ever again after I completed my final exams. But what I did use was, and I think that the things I really learned in college were about the importance of a network, the importance of relationships, and the importance of mindset. And being in a liberal arts environment where everyone is committed to learning, everyone is operating from a place of curiosity, that is such a valuable thing no matter what you're doing in life. And so I think between that mindset and the network that I built, and the things that I learned about myself, those are certainly the most valuable pieces of my education. If I could go back and give myself advice, I would tell myself to not feel pressured to specialize. I felt a lot of guilt about my level of experimentation. I actually started as a math major, and then I switched to psychology, and then I switched to art, and then I ended up doing economics, which I felt was a combination of all of that. But I think there was this illusion that I should know what I wanted to do with my life, or that I should have a direction, and that I need to pursue a very specific direction if I was going to be successful. But I don't think that's been the case. I don't think it will be the case. And the average amount of time anybody has a job today is about 18 months. So there's a lot of opportunity for experimentation, and the ability to think a few steps ahead is much more valuable than the ability to try to drive down a singular path.
That is so, so valuable. In the times when having a professional life for 30 years, people needed to know what they wanted to be and be that for their whole career. But that is no longer. And experimentation and being creative and looking for new pathways and possibly preparing yourself for a job that doesn't exist yet. That's kind of where we're at now. And I'd love to connect that with your current investment sort of thesis. Tell us more about what you're investing in and where you see, the world going.
So I've really committed my career in investing to the future of work. And it's an area I've been focused on for quite a while now. And the reason why I chose it as the area that I really wanted to focus upon was for 3 reasons. It's really big, it's really broken, and it matters a lot. So when you think about how big it is, every company spends about 70% of their budget on their workforce. And yet it's so broken that 70% of people are so unhappy at their jobs that it spills over into their personal relationships. And it matters because think about it, the only thing that you're gonna do more than work in your lifetime is sleep. You spend 90,000 hours at work. And so it matters at a big macro level because it is so expensive and so ubiquitous. But it also matters at a personal level because you feel it every single day. And so I felt that if there's an area where I want to have a little bit of an influence, that's definitely it. And when I first started investing in the future of work, I started out very specific, being focused on education and upskilling and reskilling, and over time found that level of focus was a little bit too narrow because it meant there were only so many great opportunities. And so then I widened my scope and kind of took a step back and built a thesis around what does the future of work look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And I came up with a concept that I use as a framework today, which is called the 5 Ds. Which is that the future of work is digital, distributed, data-driven, dynamic, and diverse. And so I invest in technology that's advancing toward that future. And so I was at a large kind of generalist fund for a while doing that, but also started to see that in a world where venture capital is becoming a bigger and bigger industry, and there's a lot of money out there, and it's actually incredibly competitive to try to get access to the best investment opportunities. And so in order to be successful, you do need to have a pretty specific focus. So I've really honed in on the relationship between the employer and the employee. And so today, SemperVirens, we invest in companies in workforce technology and healthcare technology, the financial technology that are selling to and through the employer. to help them manage their employees. So that's kind of the circular route to where I am today. But at the end of the day, it's really the future of work that gets me up in the morning.
Big, broken, and matters a lot. I love that initial kind of framework to like find, what to be working on. And of the 5 Ds you mentioned, could you maybe like highlight 1 or 2 that you think are that we should know more about? Whether it's the diverse piece or the distributed piece.
Sure. The distributed piece is really interesting. It was obvious to me when I was living and working in Asia, but investing in companies mostly in the US and Europe. And we're only seeing the world move more in that direction. So when I say distributed, I certainly mean from a geographic perspective. Remote work is becoming more and more popular, and definitely see that as the future. But it's also becoming more distributed over time. So to the point that I was making before, people don't stay in a job longer than 18 months anymore. It's very rare for that to happen. And so careers are not linear progressions. They're these sort of portfolio careers that people build over time across multiple roles, but also you're seeing people take on multiple jobs at once. So even in the knowledge space, I'm seeing a lot of really talented people leave full-time roles and instead set up their own consulting arrangement where they can work with a bunch of different clients at one time. So that distributed element is just sort of related to the broader unbundling of what we've traditionally thought of as a job or a career. Then the other one to touch upon, which I actually added as a result of COVID, is this dynamic piece. There's a great quote, and I can't remember where I heard it, but it used to be that the big eat the small, but now it's the fast that eat the slow. And I just think that ability to adapt in real time is more valuable than ever and has been certainly highlighted by COVID. So even within large corporations, they're trying to think about how to iterate more quickly and how to be more dynamic in their budgeting, their sales strategy, et cetera. So that's a big area of focus.
The fast eat the slow, definitely. Yeah. And I think that's a really good highlight with the dynamic piece. And individually or on a corporate level, that applies. You talked about how this really matters. So I have great faith and know that what you're investing is going to be amazing and you're going to impact a lot of lives. So let's look into the future, 5-10 years from now, when your investments are coming to fruition. What kind of a world do you want to see? What kind of careers do you expect people to have? What will it look like for someone to have a good life, a good job?
I think there will be a lot more independent work. So I have a theory about the rise of the extra small businesses, which is individuals building careers as sort of entrepreneurs themselves. And that doesn't mean that you need to be a venture-backed business necessarily, but it could mean having your own freelance marketing business where you're making 3 or 4 times what you would make in a traditional full-time role. And you have a lot more flexibility to work on the things that are aligned with your values, as well as flexibility throughout the day to do other things or work whenever works for you. I really believe the future is moving in that direction. I also believe that in the future, people will be reskilling and upskilling on a regular basis. So sure, I think the 4-year degree will take a long time to go away, but people will also be engaging in new types of education on a really regular basis so that they can get to that next step. So I think the world really will be those 5 Ds.
I would love to look forward and live in that world where not only is my job, but my children's job to embrace the 5 Ds you talked about. Especially the dynamic piece, because that's what makes life interesting. And when we have good work, then we we're able to self-actualize, and like you said, it spills over to the relationships we have in life. Last question for you, Allison. So what's the best part of your job? What do you like most about what you do?
Okay, I can't just pick one. I have to pick two. My first answer is definitely all of the passionate, curious, talented people that I get to meet as part of my core job, right? Like, it is my responsibility to go find amazing people doing amazing things, and that is so energizing to me. And I think the second piece is something for people who are thinking about getting into investing to really consider. I really enjoy the fact that venture is the best of both worlds. I get to be part of a team of great people, but I also am able to operate very, very independently and creatively. So that's something that fits my personality and mode of working, where I like to just be off, thinking about the next thing and meeting people and doing things my way, but coming back to a team that is cohesive around a mission and the strategy and values. I really think that's the best of both worlds.
Allison, thank you so much. The sharing today itself was dynamic, regenerative, and multidimensional. And I think people will learn so much from you. Thank you so much for your time, Allison.
Thanks for having me.